Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into something that I think is pretty relevant to all of us, and that's our workplace rights, specifically the Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972.
Oh, yeah.
Now, I know you might be thinking 1972, does that even still apply?
Right.
Trust me, it does. And it's more relevant than ever, whether you're just starting your career or if you're a seasoned pro. We're lucky to have expert speaker with us today
Right.
to unpack the ins and outs of this landmark legislation. So let's get right into it. What exactly is the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, and what does it aim to do?
Well, imagine a workplace where everyone, regardless of their background, has a fair chance to succeed. That's essentially what the Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972 strives to achieve.
Oh, okay.
It's about, preventing discrimination and ensuring equal opportunities for everyone.
Okay, so it levels the playing field, so to speak. But
Mhm.
where did this all begin? Was 1972 really the start of this?
That's a good question. While 1972 was a pivotal year, the roots actually go back even further to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The 1972 Act built upon that foundation, broadening its scope and really giving it some teeth.
So it's about more than just who gets hired.
Absolutely. We're talking about the entire employee experience, hiring, firing, promotions, pay, training opportunities, even the work environment itself. It's all covered under this act.
Right.
And to make sure it's enforced, we have the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, an independent federal agency dedicated to making this a reality.
Okay, so the EEOC is like the watchdog, making sure that employers are playing by the rules. What I find fascinating is how it's not just about race or religion anymore. What are some of the other characteristics that are protected under this act?
You're right, it has expanded over time. It now includes protection based on sex, national origin, disability, age, sexual orientation, gender identity, and even retaliation for reporting discrimination.
Wow, that's a pretty comprehensive list. This act really does cover a lot of ground. But how does it apply in real life? I mean, does it only apply to, like, those massive corporations that we always hear about? What about smaller businesses?
You'd be surprised. While it's easy to assume that this is only for the Fortune 500 companies, it actually applies to employers with 15 or more employees.
15. Seriously.
Yeah.
It's way smaller than I would have guessed. I bet a lot of our listeners are just as surprised as I am.
It's a common misconception. Of course, there are a few exceptions built into the law. Like, religious institutions have some leeway when it comes to certain roles, and private clubs have their own set of rules. But these are very specific and limited. For the most part, if you're an employer, this act likely applies to you.
That's a really important takeaway for everyone listening, especially those entrepreneurs and small business owners out there. It's not just about avoiding lawsuits, it's about creating a fair and equitable workplace for everyone. Speaking of which, let's get into the nitty-gritty. What are some of the specific things this act prohibits when it comes to discrimination?
This is where things get interesting. We're talking about a wide range of prohibited conduct. Hiring, firing, promotions, how much you get paid, training opportunities that you're offered or denied, you name it.
Yeah.
But there's one area I really want to emphasize, and that's harassment.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because harassment can be such a tricky area. What does the act actually say about that?
You're absolutely right. It's often more nuanced than people think. We tend to picture blatant harassment. But the act goes beyond that. It covers any unwelcome conduct based on those protected characteristics we talked about.
Okay.
Yeah.
So give us some examples. What kind of behavior would fall under that umbrella?
It could be anything from offensive jokes and slurs to intimidation, or even creating a hostile work environment based on someone's religion or national origin.
Uh-huh.
And here's the kicker. It doesn't even have to come from a supervisor. It could be from coworkers, clients, anyone you interact with in your work environment.
That's a game changer, isn't it?
Yeah.
So even if my boss isn't the one behaving badly, the company could still be held accountable.
Exactly. Especially if they knew or should have known about it and didn't take steps to stop it.
Okay, so it's not just about individual actions. It's about the overall culture of the workplace. But let's say someone listening right now is thinking, hold on, I think I might be experiencing some of this.
Yeah.
What's the next step? Who do they turn to?
This is where understanding the complaint process is crucial. It can feel really daunting to even think about taking action, especially in the situation where you might already be feeling vulnerable. But remember, that's why this act exists, to protect you and your rights.
So let's demystify the process a bit. Where does someone even begin if they think they've experienced discrimination at work?
It all starts with the EEOC, that agency we talked about earlier. They're the ones who investigate these kinds of claims. But here's the catch. There's a time limit for filing a complaint.
A time limit? Okay, so there's some urgency here. How long do people have?
You generally have 180 days from the date of the discriminatory act, so it's not something you want to sit on for too long.
6 months. That makes sense. But what if you're in a state that has its own discrimination laws? Does that affect the timeline at all?
You're one step ahead of me. You're right, it can. If your state or city has its own laws and agencies that are dealing with workplace discrimination, you might have up to 300 days to file with the EEOC.
Okay.
But here's the thing, it's always best to act sooner rather than later.
Why is that? What's the downside of waiting even if you technically have the time?
Well, think of it this way. The EEOC is like a detective building a case. They need evidence, right?
Right.
But memories fade, witnesses might become unavailable. Documents can get lost. Time can work against you.
Yeah.
Plus, some state agencies actually require you to file with them first before going to the EEOC.
Oh, interesting. So if you're unsure, it's probably best to reach out to the EEOC or a local agency sooner rather than later, just to be safe. But okay, let's say someone's ready to file a complaint. What's the next step? Do you just send them a strongly worded email?
I wish it were that simple. There's actually a formal process. It starts with filing something called a charge of discrimination.
Okay. Sounds serious. What is that exactly?
It's basically a legal document where you lay out the details of what happened. You'll need to be specific who was involved, when and where the discrimination took place, and what evidence you have to support your claim.
Okay, so it's not just about how you felt. It's about the actual facts of the situation.
Precisely. And don't worry, it might sound intimidating, but the EEOC website has tons of resources to help you through it, including templates and instructions for filing a charge. You can even file it online by mail or in person at an EEOC office.
So they've tried to make the process as user-friendly as possible, which is great. But what happens after you hit submit on that charge of discrimination? Do the EEOC just take your word for it?
Not quite. They'll review your charge and decide if they have jurisdiction, meaning whether it falls under their authority based on the law. If they do, that's when the real investigation begins.
Okay, now we're getting into the nitty-gritty. What does an EEOC investigation actually involve?
They're going to be gathering as much information as possible to determine if there's reasonable cause to believe that discrimination occurred. This isn't like a criminal trial. They're not looking for proof beyond a shadow of a doubt. It's more about whether the evidence supports your claim.
So they're taking on the role of a neutral third party trying to get to the bottom of what happened.
Exactly. They might ask you for more information to interview witnesses, even request documents from your employer. Your employer also has a chance to respond to your claims, so both sides get to share their perspective.
That makes sense. It's all about fairness and due process. But let's talk about the possible outcomes here. What happens if the EEOC does find reasonable cause? And what if they don't?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? If they do find reasonable cause, the EEOC will first try to resolve the issue through mediation.
Mediation, so like a neutral third party trying to help everyone reach some kind of compromise.
Exactly. It's a way to try to reach a settlement outside of court. Both you and your employer would work with a mediator to see if you can find a solution that everyone can live with. This could involve things like back pay, a promotion, changes to company policies. It really depends on the situation.
Okay.
But it's important to remember that mediation is voluntary.
So you're not forced to accept a settlement if you don't feel like it's fair.
Exactly. You always have the right to say no and pursue other options.
And what are those other options? What happens if mediation fails or if the EEOC decides not to go that route in the first place?
Well, if the EEOC finds reasonable cause and mediation doesn't work out, or if they decide against mediation, they have the power to file a lawsuit against your employer on your behalf.
Wow, so they become your legal advocate.
In a way, yes. They would be the ones taking your employer to court, but you'd still be involved in the process. And it's important to note that even if the EEOC doesn't find reasonable cause or decides not to file a lawsuit themselves, you still have the option to file a lawsuit on your own. But having the EEOC on your side can make a big difference.
I can imagine having that legal expertise and support would be invaluable in a situation like that. This has been so eye-opening. It sounds like the EEOC really has a system in place to protect employees, but it's also clear that this process can be long and complex. What advice would you give to someone who might be facing a situation at work but isn't sure if it crosses the line into discrimination?
Yeah, you've hit on a really important point. Sometimes it's hard to know if what you're experiencing is actually discrimination or just a difficult work environment. My advice, when in doubt, document everything.
Document everything. That sounds familiar. Didn't we hear that somewhere before?
It's worth repeating. Seriously, if something happens, anything that makes you uncomfortable or that you think might be discriminatory, write it down. Dates, times, witnesses, what was said, any emails or messages. Keep a detailed record.
So if you ever do need to file a complaint, you have that paper trail to back you up.
Exactly. It can be incredibly valuable if things escalate. And here's another thing to keep in mind. Don't forget about your company's own policies on discrimination and harassment.
Right. Those employee handbooks that we all skim through during onboarding. Turns out they might actually be important.
More than just important, they can be incredibly helpful. Many companies have their own internal procedures for reporting these kinds of issues, and they might even offer additional protections beyond what the law requires.
So it's always a good idea to be informed. Know your company's policies, know your rights under the law. Knowledge is power, right?
Absolutely. The more you know, the better equipped you are to advocate for yourself and create a positive change in your workplace.
I couldn't agree more. This deep dive has been eye-opening, and honestly, it's empowering to know more about this important act.
I agree. Knowledge and understanding are the first steps towards building a more equitable future for everyone in the workplace.
A huge thank you to expert speaker for guiding us through the ins and outs of the Equal Employment Opportunity Act. And for our listeners, remember, this is just a starting point. We've linked to the full text of the Act in the show notes, and the EEOC website is a goldmine of information if you want to explore further. The Equal Employment Opportunity Act was a landmark achievement, but it's really up to each of us to create a workplace where everyone feels valued and respected. So here's something to think about. What can you do in your own workplace to champion equality and make sure everyone has a seat at the table? That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Until next time, stay curious.